Chapter 26. The Mean Mrs. Jewls. Everybody in Mrs. Jewls's class thought she was a very nice teacher. They were wrong. There's no such thing as a nice teacher. If you think you have a nice teacher, then you are wrong too. Inside every nice teacher, there is a mean and rotten teacher bursting to get out. The nicer the teacher is on the outside, the meaner the teacher inside is. As Mrs. Jewls was changing the bulletin board before class, a mean and rotten voice whispered inside her brain. "Give the children lots of busy work today," it said, "and then make them do it over again if their handwriting isn't perfect." Mrs. Jewls tried very hard to ignore the voice. She didn't like giving busy work. Instead, she tried to teach the children 3 new things every day. She believed that if they learned 3 new things every day, they would eventually learn everything there is to know. There are some classes where the teachers give so much busy work that the children never learn anything. "What do you care if the children learn anything?" asked the mean and rotten voice. "It's not your job to teach them, it's your job to punish them. Keep them in at recess. Hit them with your yardstick." The bell rang and all the kids scurried to their desks. "We are going to learn 3 new things today," Mrs. Jewls announced. "How to make pickles, 7 plus 4, and the capital of England." All the children paid close attention. "The capital of England is London," said Mrs. Jewls. 7 plus 4 equals 11, and pickles are made by sticking cucumbers in brine. On her desk, she had a box of cucumbers and a vat of brine for a demonstration. "Okay, Joe," said Mrs. Jewls. "How much is 7 plus 4? Joe shrugged. "But I just told you, Joe," said Mrs. Jewls. "Weren't you listening?" "I don't know," said Joe. "Okay, who can tell me how pickles are made?" "Yes, Jason." 11, Jason declared. Mrs. Jewls frowned. "That's a correct answer," she said, "but unfortunately, I didn't ask the right question. Can anyone tell me how pickles are made?" "Yes, Bibi." "In London," said Bibi. "I suppose they make some pickles in London," said Mrs. Jewls. "Okay, let's start again. Calvin, what's the capital of England?" "Could you write England on the board?" asked Calvin. "I can do a lot better when I see the question." Mrs. Jewls wrote England on the board. "Oh, okay," said Calvin now that he saw the question. "The capital of England is E." "Yes, that's one capital of England," Mrs. Jewls had to admit. "Okay, I will say it one more time. The capital of England is London." "Isn't that where they make all the pickles?" asked Jenny. "No, they don't make all the pickles in London," explained Allison. "Just 11. "Well, where do you make the rest of the pickles?" asked Stephen. "Shut up!" shouted Mrs. Jewls. "Well, that does it. You're all staying inside for recess." Everyone stared at her. Mrs. Jewls had never told anyone to shut up. It was against the class rules for anyone to use that expression. If you did, you had to write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Mrs. Jewls put her hand over her mouth and took it away. "Oh dear, I'm very sorry," she said. "I don't know what came over me." She wrote her own name on the blackboard under the word discipline. "Perhaps you'll learn the lesson better if you write it down," she suggested. "Everyone, please take out a piece of paper and a pickle." Everybody laughed. "Pencil," snapped Mrs. Jewls. "I meant to say pencil. It just came out pickle." "I didn't know pickles came from pencils," said Jenny. "I thought they came from cucumbers." "I thought they came from London," said Todd. Mrs. Jewls made an ugly face. "Todd, didn't I just tell you to shut up?" she asked. She picked up her yardstick and held it over Todd's head. "Well, answer me," she demanded. "Didn't I tell you to shut up?" Yes, said Todd. How dare you talk back to me? Snapped Mrs. Jewls. Didn't I just tell you to shut up? Todd kept his mouth shut. Well, answer me, she demanded. Todd didn't know what to do. He nodded his head. Keep still, ordered Mrs. Jewls. Now, I don't want you to say another word. Is that clear? Todd stared at her. Is that clear? She asked again. Yes, Todd said meekly. Mrs. Jewls slammed down the yardstick. Todd quickly moved out of the way. The yardstick banged against his desk and broke in half. Mrs. Jewls stared at the 18 inches she held in her hand. Oh my goodness, she said. I'm sorry, Todd. I don't know what's the matter with me today. I must have gotten up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. She put a check next to her name under the word discipline. Okay, let me try to make this simple, she said. If I have 7 cucumbers, and then I get 4 more cucumbers, and then I drop all the cucumbers in brine and take them to the capital of England, what do I have? How many? And where am I? Huh? Said DJ. What? Asked John. Could you write the question on the board, please? Asked Rondi. Shut up! Mrs. Jewls yelled a third time. In a mocking voice, she said, Could you write the question on the board, please? You kids think you are so cute. Well, we'll see just how cute you really are. She picked up the vat of brine from her desk. How would you like it if I poured this on your heads? You won't be so cute when you're all shriveled up and covered with warts like Pickles. She walked up and down the aisles carrying the pickle juice and glaring at the children. No one dared make a sound. She stopped next to Leslie. How about you, Leslie? She asked. Would you like pickled pigtails? Leslie trembled. Her pigtails wiggled. Well, I'm going to ask you 3 questions, Leslie, said Mrs. Jewls, and if you don't answer them all correctly, I'm going to dump this on your head. Leslie gulped. Question 1, said Mrs. Jewls. How much is 7 plus 4? Leslie quickly tried to count on her fingers, but she didn't have enough. 11, she guessed. A look of disappointment came over Mrs. Jewls's face. Okay, question 2. What is the capital of England? London, Leslie said nervously. Rats, said Mrs. Jewls. Okay, question 3. She looked down at the vat of brine she was holding and shook her head. She thought a moment, then smiled. What is the name of my cousin who lives in Vermont? Leslie had no idea, so she just had to take a wild guess. She closed her eyes and said, Fred Jewls? Wrong! Exclaimed Mrs. Jewls. She raised the vat of brine high above Leslie's head and started to tip it over. Paul jumped out of his seat. Those pigtails had once saved his life. Now it was his turn to return the favor. He pushed the vat of brine back the other way. He was just trying to push it up straight, but he pushed it too hard. It poured all over Mrs. Jewls, drenching her. Paul froze in terror. Mrs. Jewls blinked her eyes. Pickle juice dripped down her face. Thanks, Paul, she said. I needed that. The brine had cured her. She circled her name on the blackboard and sent herself home early on the kindergarten bus. Chapter 27, Lost and Found. Joy and Mauricia were best friends. They sat down on the grass to eat their lunches, but then Mauricia remembered she needed chocolate milk. She went to get some from Miss Mush. When she returned, she couldn't find her lunch. What happened to my lunch? She asked. Joy looked up at her, then shrugged her shoulders. I set my lunch down right here, said Mauricia. You saw me, didn't you? Joy shook her head. I put it here, then I went to Miss Mush's room to get some chocolate milk. I had a peanut butter and banana sandwich, and there's no way I can eat a peanut butter and banana sandwich without chocolate milk. Joy shrugged her shoulders. Mauricia didn't know what to do. Can I have a sip of your milk? Asked Joy. It was hard for Joy to talk because her mouth was full of peanut butter and bananas. Mauricia handed Joy the carton of chocolate milk. Joy took a drink, then swallowed. Mauricia looked all around for her lunch. She crawled in the dirt as she searched through the bushes. "Any luck?" asked Joy as she finished Mauricia's chocolate milk. "I found it!" Mauricia exclaimed. Joy coughed on the chocolate milk. "You did?" she asked, then coughed again. Mauricia crawled out of the bushes holding a paper sack. She sat down next to Joy and opened it. "Is it your lunch?" asked Joy. "No," said Mauricia. "Too bad," said Joy. "It's money!" exclaimed Mauricia. Joy's eyes nearly popped out of her head as she looked at the paper bag. It was stuffed with dollar bills, and they weren't just $1 bills. There were a few $5 bills, some $10 bills, but mostly $20 bills. "We found $1 million!" Joy whispered. "We?" asked Mauricia. They counted the money. It wasn't $1 million. It was $20,655. "Let's split it," said Joy. "You take half and I'll take half." "Maybe I should show it to Louis," said Mauricia. "Louis!" exclaimed Joy. "Are you crazy? Let's spend it. We can buy a skateboard or a bicycle or a horse or a fancy car or an airplane." "I like taking the bus," said Mauricia. "You could buy ice cream," said Joy. "All the ice cream you ever want for the rest of your life." She knew Mauricia loved ice cream more than anything else in the world. Mauricia smiled as she thought about it. "No, I better show it to Louis. He'll know what to do." "You'll just get in trouble," warned Joy. "Louis will think you robbed a bank. You'll go to jail for the rest of your life." "Louis knows I'm not a bank robber," said Mauricia. "But what if the real bank robbers find out you have their money?" asked Joy. "They'll come after you and murder you." "Oh, I don't think of that," said Mauricia. "You better give it to me," said Joy. "Louis will protect me," said Mauricia. She walked across the playground. Louis was talking to Terrence. He said, "If you ever tie Leslie's pigtails to the tetherball pole again, I'll—" "Louis, look!" said Mauricia. She held the paper sack up to his face. "No, thank you, Mauricia. I'm not hungry," said Louis. "It's not my lunch," said Mauricia. "Look inside." Louis took the bag from her and looked inside. "Very nice," he said. Then he gave it back to her. "Now, I want you to go untie Leslie and tell her—" He suddenly stopped talking and blinked his eyes. He looked at Terrence, then at Mauricia, then at Terrence, then at Mauricia, and then at the paper sack. "Let me see that again," he said. Mauricia gave him the bag. "Hey, what about me?" asked Terrence. "Get lost, Jack Frost," said Louis. Terrence ran away. "Did you rob a bank?" asked Louis. "No, I found it in the bushes," said Mauricia. "I believe you," said Louis. "We'll have to put it in the lost and found." "I know," said Mauricia. "Whoever lost it is probably very sad." "But if no one claims it in 2 weeks, you can have it," said Louis. He took the bag of money and headed to the office. Joy was waiting for Louis at the door. "Hey, Louis," she said. "I lost a bag full of money. Have you seen it?" "Help!" Leslie screamed from the tetherball court. A week later, Mauricia was eating lunch alone. She was eating a piece of sweet potato pie. Joy was crawling around in the dirt looking for more bags of money. "Mauricia," said Louis, "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Mr. Finch." Mr. Finch was an old man with white hair and a long white beard. He shook Mauricia's hand with both of his hands. "It's your money, isn't it?" asked Mauricia. Mr. Finch nodded. "It was my life savings," he said. "For 50 years I made pencils. I got a penny for every pencil I made. I hate pencils. But finally I saved enough money to quit my job and do what I always wanted to do." "What's that?" asked Mauricia. "I'm going to open my own ice cream parlor," he said, then started to cry. "When I lost that money, I thought I'd have to start making pencils again." Mauricia cried too. "Here, I want you to have this," blubbered Mr. Finch. He gave her an envelope containing $500. It was the second largest amount of money Mauricia had ever had. "And I will give you free ice cream for the rest of your life at my ice cream parlor," he promised. Thank you, said Mauricia. No, thank you, said Mr. Finch. I'm so glad someone as kind and honest as you found it. There are so many dishonest people in the world. It's good to know there are still good people, too. They hugged each other. Joy crawled out of the bushes. Hey, what's that? She asked. This is Mr. Finch, said Mauricia. It's his money. Look, he gave me a reward of $500, and I'll get free ice cream for the rest of my life. Well, what about me? Joy demanded. Don't I get anything? Oh, dear me, said Mr. Finch. I didn't realize there was someone else involved. Mauricia would never have found the money if it wasn't for me, said Joy. Why, what'd you do? Asked Louis. I stole her lunch, Joy said proudly. Mr. Finch gave her a pencil. Chapter 28. Valouche. Mrs. Jewls rang her cowbell. I have some wonderful news, she said. The children stopped what they were doing and looked up. They waited for Mrs. Jewls to tell them the wonderful news. You are a very lucky class indeed, said Mrs. Jewls. Mrs. Valouche, the world-famous dancer, will be coming here to Wayside School. She will teach you how to dance. Everyone was still waiting for the wonderful news. Isn't that exciting? Asked Mrs. Jewls. You will see her every Wednesday instead of going to P.E. Will girls have to dance with boys? Asked Jenny. I suppose, said Mrs. Jewls. Gross! Exclaimed Leslie. Yuck! Said Dana. Will boys have to dance with girls? Asked Ron. Obviously, said Mrs. Jewls. No way, said Mr. Fry. I'd rather dance with a dead rat, said Terence. Everybody started talking at once about cooties and warts and other horrible diseases they could get from touching girls or boys. Mrs. Jewls rang her cowbell again and told them to settle down. Mrs. Jewls, I don't need to take dancing lessons, said Eric Bacon. I already know how to dance. Yes, Eric, I've seen you dance, Mrs. Jewls said sarcastically. Eric Bacon was a great break dancer, but break dancing was no longer allowed at Wayside School. That was because every time Eric danced, he broke something. Mrs. Valouche will teach you the grace and beauty of classical ballroom dancing, said Mrs. Jewls. Everybody groaned. On Wednesday, they all headed down to their first dancing lesson, except Myron. Myron went to P.E. How come Myron never has to do anything? Asked Jason. I don't know, said Calvin. I've been wondering about that, too. Myron's father must be friends with the president, said Bebe. I think Myron gave Mr. Kidswatter $1,000, said Todd. No, I bet he's blackmailing Mrs. Jewls, said Jenny. How could he do that? Asked Benjamin. Maybe Mrs. Jewls got drunk, said Jenny, and then she danced on top of her desk with a lampshade on her head, and Myron took her picture, and so now Mrs. Jewls has to let Myron do anything he wants, or else he'll show the picture to Mr. Kidswatter. That makes sense, said Mac. Except if she had a lampshade on her head, how would Mr. Kidswatter know it was Mrs. Jewls? Asked Todd. No one knew the answer to that. They entered the classroom on the second floor. Welcome, said Mrs. Valouche, a strange-looking woman with bright red hair. It looked like her head was on fire. My name is Miss Valouche. It's so wonderful to be here at Wayside School. She wore pink tights and a sparkling pink top. I hope we will be friends, yes? She asked. Nobody said a word. All around were red and green balls. There was also one yellow ball. This was the room where Louis kept the balls for lunch and recess. It was also the room that was always used for school dances. It was the ballroom. So, explained Mrs. Valouche, who will be first? Everyone tried to hide behind someone else. Mrs. Valouche put her hands on Ron's face. What is your name? She asked. Ron, he squeaked. Ronaldo, bellowed Mrs. Valouche, king of the gypsies. I don't know how to dance, said Ron. Dance? Asked Mrs. Valouche. She looked very surprised. "We are not going to dance," she said. "We're not?" asked Ron. "No, Ronaldo," whispered Mrs. Volusia. "We are going to tango." She put her left arm around Ron's waist. Then she grabbed his left hand with her right and stuck it way out in front of them. Suddenly, the music started. Mrs. Volusia dragged poor Ron across the room as she stomped her feet in time to the music. Dump, 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 da da, dump, 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 da dump, da dump, 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 dump. Hey! When she yelled, "Hey!" she threw Ron up in the air and clapped her hands. Ron turned a somersault in mid-air. Then Mrs. Volusia caught him. They tangoed back to where they started. Ron's eyes were spinning in opposite directions. "Hey, that looked like fun," said Mauricia. "Do me." "Very well," said Mrs. Volusia. She grabbed Mauricia and tangoed with her across the room. Dump, 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 da da da, dump. Da-dump, da-dump, dump, 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 dump. "Hey!" She threw Mauricia up in the air and clapped her hands. Mauricia turned a double somersault before Mrs. Volusia caught her. They tangoed back to the front. "My turn," said Terence. As Mrs. Volusia tangoed with Terence, the other kids stamped their feet along with Mrs. Volusia. They all yelled, "Hey!" at the same time and clapped their hands. One by one, Mrs. Volusia tangoed with every kid in the class. The other kids danced with each other. Boys danced with girls, and girls danced with boys. They didn't care. Paul danced with Leslie. Dana danced with John. Terence danced with Rondi. Allison danced with Jason. DJ danced with Kathy. Todd danced with Joy. "Hey!" they all shouted together. Of course, they weren't strong enough to throw each other up in the air. Instead, they tried to trip each other and throw each other to the ground. "Hey!" Even Kathy was having fun. "Hey!" they shouted as she kicked DJ in the rear end. They also threw the balls at each other. "Hey!" Mrs. Volusia began to get tired. Sometimes she didn't catch the children after she tossed them in the air. Dee Dee crashed to the floor. "Wow," she said, "this is more fun than Murder the Man with the Ball. Hey!" At last the music stopped. Dump, 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 dump. Dump, 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 and everyone shouted, "Hey!" one last time. Mrs. Volusia clapped her hands. "Wonderful!" she explained. "Fantastic!" They all staggered out of the ballroom, cut up, bruised, and bleeding. "Next week, we waltz," Mrs. Volusia called after them. "So, how did everyone like dancing?" asked Mrs. Jewls when they returned. "Dance?" asked Ronaldo, king of the gypsies. "We didn't dance." "You didn't?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "No," said Ronaldo. "We tangoed." Everyone cheered. "It was wonderful!" exclaimed Kathy. "Fantastic!" said Terence. Myron was sorry he had missed it. "I can't wait till next Wednesday," said Todd.